We're rolling.
Okay. Hello, Facebook. I am Abby Kirk here live with Dr. Scott Hall, who is a professor here at Ball State University in the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences. And I reached out to him because I'm working on a project about single parents in Delaware County, and I wanted kind of an expert opinion on the positive and negative effects single parenting has on the family aspect. So thank you for joining us today. How
Sure.
are you?
Doing well, thanks.
So I guess to start us off, could you just give us a little background of what you do at Ball State, or a little bit of history of yourself?
Yeah, I'm a professor of family studies, and most people say, what is family studies? But it's just kind of like what it sounds. You study families, but I do research in marriage and family related things, and our students are often going into communities and where they can help strengthen families, help them find resources, education, different types of things there. So it's very practical in a sense, but the issues themselves can be also very philosophical and ideological and challenging.
Right. So just my next question would be, so according to the U.S. Census, which is what my project entailed, was to look at the U.S. Census, find an issue, and I pulled out single parents as an issue in Delaware County. And it estimates that 4,434 people are single parents in Delaware County. Do you find this number surprising?
No, I it's hard without thinking of, well, what exactly is the population? I mean, we're around Delaware County. I'm not even sure how large. I know Muncie's 50 some odd thousand, right around there. So, but I know Delaware County has a reputation for having kind of a diverse range of socioeconomic status. So,
So
I don't think
because
that's
it's
particularly
diverse,
surprising.
You don't find it very surprising. So what do you think are some major causes for single parenting?
Divorce is one of the biggest. Really, there's two main causes: divorce and not marrying in the first place, unwed parenthood. And they're kind of different circumstances. If you've already been married and have a history together and then break up, that history is different than if maybe you are a single mother, which is most single parents, and you don't necessarily have the father in the child's life. The history is very different, so they may not know anything else other than being a single parent.
Right. So do you think that there is a difference between single female parents versus male single parents? And why do you think that is?
I've read a little bit about this. It's been a little while, but single parent fathers are pretty rare, and on average, economics tend to be a little bit better for single fathers, but it's not clear cut. There's some indication that kids might get into more trouble in the single father household. Some of this also depends on gender. So, for example, in most single parent households where there's a mother, sons often struggle the most, and so they think that part of the father loss affects the sons in different ways than the daughters, and so there's not as much comparison. I'm not sure if I've seen anything recently about daughters struggling more than sons in single father households, but single fathers often come to that point because a mother's been deemed unfit, and so that means there's other circumstances that are more challenging. But at the same time, some of the single fathers really fought for it and really wanted that custody. Right. And so you figure if that happens, regardless of who the parent is, it's probably going to be better circumstance because they're invested in the family.
Right. So do you think, or what do you think are some psychological effects on the children?
Well, there's lots of different things that can happen depending on the circumstances. For example, one might be a feeling of a parental loss. Who is my other parent if they don't know who that parent is or don't spend much time with that other parent? Or again, if they're shifting back and forth between two households of single parents, that's also a very different circumstance, each of which can have its own psychological impacts, but all of which have some kind of potential loss. Either they had something and lost it, or they fantasize about what it would be like if I had another parent here. And so depending on what happens, there could be some blaming of the parent who's gone, or blaming of the parent who's there. You pushed them off. That could be hard for everybody. There could be a sense of, sometimes kids have to grow up a little faster in single parenthood. That's where some research has been showing this, almost like a culture of independence. Mm-hmm. If I have to be leaned on more as a child, then maybe I grow up a little bit faster and have to become more resilient and do more on my own, and maybe I feel like I can't rely on others. So there's some good sides to that. There's also some bad sides to that in your own in their own relationships later on. If they become too independent and they can't rely on others, they may have difficulty ever depending on somebody.
Right.
And sometimes adult children of divorce or single parenthood, if they really did have to carry a lot of the load once they're adults, sometimes they kind of reject adulthood and responsibility. Feel like I never was able to be a child, and now that I have some freedom, I'm going to be more like a child than an adult. Mm-hmm. Now, one big caveat to all this, there are plenty of kids in these circumstances that do well and do fine and maybe even thrive. So talking about averages, odds, those kinds of things, where clearly, if you look at it as groups, there are more challenges for those, all else being equal, growing up in a single parent home, but it's not all or nothing for sure.
Right. I think a lot of people put emphasis on the children and the effects that it has on the children specifically, mm-hmm. but what about the parents?
Sure.
Do you think there's any psychological effects on them?
Well, parenting's really hard. It's a cliche, but I think it's because it's true. I can speak to that. And so even just when you have a partner and you're co-parenting, it's challenging enough. It can be overwhelming. Mm-hmm. When you don't have that extra support, then just the strain itself, or feeling like I have to make all the decisions, I don't have maybe someone to help bounce some ideas off of, to get some support. I only have my own strengths or weaknesses to work with. I don't have someone else's, where they might be a better match in this circumstance or with this child, mm-hmm. but I have to do all that. I've also heard on the upside, single parents say, well, they do get to call all the shots, so it's a double-edged sword. So some people really like, if they're really particular on things and they might have a difficult time compromising with another parent, they at least can have things the way they want. Right. But then it's just the amount of energy and work, not being able to share the load itself can be pretty challenging.
So I was doing some research online about groups for single parents out there. There's like Parents Without Partners. They have various chapters. I think the closest one to us is in Marion. But are you familiar with any groups, or do you recommend any groups for single parents out there?
I'm not familiar with any local groups per se, but I like the idea.
I think it's a growing thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's people are starting to form these groups as a way for them to get through it together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, let's see. In addition to money, are there any other factors that contribute in the difficulty of being a single parent today in raising a successful child?
Parental monitoring is one of the biggest predictors of whether or not kids get into trouble, especially adolescents. And so again, one person usually doesn't monitor as well as two people mm-hmm. or more. So the more people you have and the more caring adults someone has in their life that they're connected to, there's some assets there. So part of it is whether or not parents know where their kids are and what their kids are doing. And so one monitor versus two, there's some limits there as well.
Right.
And then, like I said before, it's just stress and workload, and like I said, you may feel a little constrained because you don't have someone else's talents and abilities to mix with yours. You're left mm-hmm. to whatever you happen to have or don't have.
Yeah. So, lastly, what do you think needs to be done in order to help single parents?
Big question. I mean, that's a big issue, and there's lots of different ideas, and I think many different things happening at the same time is ideal. You've got to tackle economic resources. They're still a big part of the equation. They're not all of it. And frankly, there are tons of resources out there as far as helping people not starve. Now, going beyond that, it can be challenging. But certainly having sources of economic resources to help them, and also preventative type things, which are tougher. Preventative are sometimes they're more cultural, philosophical, and we have a culture today that's become more and more inclusive and accepting, which has lots of great elements to it. A potential downside to that is that it makes it easier for people to make decisions that aren't necessarily as ideal for the family situation. So I'm not suggesting that every single parent deliberately made that decision, because they come to it through a variety of ways. And there are certainly people who in the ideal wouldn't necessarily want that, and they just live in circumstances to where they feel like a child is actually going to better my circumstances rather than make it more challenging. And so that's a different type of thing. So how do you help circumstances to which a person wouldn't think that if I bring a child into my life that is already chaotic, it's going to make it better? Because ideally you want to have a pretty healthy atmosphere in which to bring a child. And so people who can, it sounds kind of cliche, but education and work, trying to get the front end. And I think frankly helping people understand that it is a little easier, and children are generally better off if you can have the two parents involved. That's part of it, and I don't think that's very controversial these days. I think most people understand. It's just more challenging at the very least, with one parent as mentioned. So it's a tricky thing for society on, do we stigmatize single parenthood, which makes it arguably harder for them, but it also makes it easier for enables more people maybe to do that, arguably. So it's kind of like, where do you find a balance of, you don't want to necessarily stigmatize people, but you don't also want to give this false narrative that no matter what you do, everything's going to be fine and dandy, it's all equally great, because that's just not reality. So educating people to that, helping them get into a better circumstance again, to where they don't feel desperate to the point to where I need a child to make me feel like I'm a good person or to prove a point, but that they have opportunities in life as much as possible. So they're not using a child to fill the void, but they're choosing to have a child because they already have a pretty decent circumstance.
Right.
That's not real specific, because it's hard to do.
It's hard, and I honestly, I think divorce is becoming the new norm, and we see a lot of single parents out there. So what is our take on it? You know, I think it's becoming a lot more accepting to see a parent raise a child on its own. But you know, back in the day, it took two partners to make it happen. So.
And you mentioned, I didn't really talk about prevention in terms of divorce, but obviously anything that can help people stay together for the right reasons, for good reasons. Not that it's a dangerous situation, but that they're committed to it and they believe it's the best circumstance for them, and therefore they'll make it into a good situation. And again, those are kind of tricky things to do. People often don't seek out help until it's too late, or they don't really feel like it's going to help them. So people say if you can have marriage classes on campus like we have, or high school, or get some kind of education, relationship skills certainly might help with that. But I think we also have to, as a culture, be comfortable with the idea that life isn't always perfect. And if it's not perfect, then it doesn't mean switching to something else is going to be more perfect, because that something else is often not any better or worse. And so it's, a lot of people say we like instant gratification, and I think there's some of that that's part of this whole question that you're talking about, at least that we can do things that lead to these situations. And with marriage and family, they're not always instantly gratifying. I think they are in the big picture long term, but when the going gets tough, it's it's tempting to say, hey, well, I'll just do something different for myself, but then it has some chain reactions too.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for joining us today. Is there any questions that I didn't ask, or last comments you have?
Oh, those are good questions. I think that covers it pretty well.
Okay, awesome. Well, for all of you out there, if you want to follow along on this project with me, you can log on to my blog at aekirk.wixsite.com/journalist. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.